Hello, everybody. I'm glad to see you all again. I wish I really could see you face to face, but I'm pretending. Today, we're going to start The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe as chapter 1 of Storytime with Miss Peggy. And as you can remember, having watched all of the episodes of the Magician's Nephew, which I hope you really did, if not, go back and see those first before you start on this chapter. Anyway, as you know, Narnia was a country that was started by Aslan, that beautiful picture of our Savior, the Lord Jesus, as he spoke that magical world into existence. And so I thought maybe you might like to see a map of Narnia, which C.S. Lewis has very kindly drawn for us and put at the very first page of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. It's a bit dark, but I'm going to hold it up close to the camera so you can see. All right, let's see there. That's not too bad. You've got just about everything in there. And maybe you can see that in the middle it says Narnia. And then up above that, there's a picture of Aslan. Over to one side, there's the ocean. Below Narnia is Archenland. And below Archenland is the country of Calormen, and we'll read about those countries in upcoming books. But anyway, that's what it looks like, and maybe we'll refer to this map again. Anyway, let's get started with the book. And chapter 1 is entitled Lucy Looks into a Wardrobe. Once there were 4 children whose names were Peter, Susan, Edmund, and Lucy. This is the story about something that happened to them when they were sent away from London during the war because of the air raids. Now, you know how I am. I have to take a little moment and explain a few things. When the war was going on, as you know, the story is set in the city of London, the enemy airplanes were coming over almost every day and every night, and they were dropping bombs on the city of London. And parents were very worried. Well, they were worried for themselves, but they were also very worried for their children. So the British government set up a wide system of sending all the children from the big cities out into the countryside to stay with people who'd be willing to have them stay there for a while. They didn't know how long, but people volunteered to have children from the city come and stay with them. And many of them didn't know the people they were going to. If they had relatives out in the countryside, in villages and small towns, then that was all well and good. But many times the families didn't know each other, and it was sort of a scary experience. The children were put onto trains and buses and shipped off and didn't know when they would see their parents again. And the parents also were sad because they didn't know when they'd see their children again either. And in our story today, these 4 children have been sent by their parents from London off into the countryside to stay with some people that they didn't know. They were sent to the house of an old professor who lived in the heart of the country, 10 miles from the nearest railway station and 2 miles from the nearest post office. He had no wife, and he lived in a very large house with a housekeeper named Mrs. Macready and her 3 servants. Their names were Ivy, Margaret, and Betty, but they don't come into the story very much. He himself was a very old man with shaggy white hair, which grew over most of his face. In other words, he had a big mustache and a big beard too, as well as on his head, and they liked him almost at once. Now, we're not told right here in chapter 1 what his name is, but I wonder if you can guess. Did you guess that his name was Diggory Kirke? If you did, you were right. This is Diggory Kirke, all grown up and living in that big house that his father inherited when his relative passed away and left it to him. Exciting. But they liked him almost at once. But on the first evening when he came out to meet them at the front door, he was so odd looking that Lucy, who was the youngest, was a little bit afraid of him. And Edmund, who was the next youngest, wanted to laugh and kept on pretending that he was blowing his nose to hide it. As soon as they had said good night to the professor and gone upstairs on that very first night, the boys came into the girls' room and they all talked it over. "We've fallen on our feet and no mistake," said Peter. "This is going to be perfectly splendid. That old chap will let us do anything we like." "I think he's such an old dear," said Susan. "Oh, come off it," said Edmund, who was tired and pretending not to be tired, which always made him bad-tempered. "Don't go on talking like that." "Like what?" said Susan. "And anyway, it's time you were in bed." "You're trying to talk like mother," said Edmund. "And who are you to say when I should go to bed? You go to bed yourself." "Hadn't we all better go to bed?" said Lucy. "There's sure to be a row if we're heard talking up here." "No, there won't," said Peter. "I tell you, this is the sort of house where no one's going to mind what we do. Anyway, they won't hear us. It's about 10 minutes walk from here down to that dining room and any amount of stairs and passages in between." "What's that noise?" said Lucy suddenly. It was a far larger house than she had ever been in before, and the thought of all those long passageways and rows of doors leading into empty rooms began to make her feel a little bit creepy. "It's only a bird, silly," said Edmund. "It's an owl," said Peter. "This is going to be a wonderful place for birds. I shall go to bed now. I say, let's go and explore tomorrow. You might find anything in a place like this. Did you see those mountains as we came along? There might be eagles. There might be stags. There will be hawks." "Badgers," said Lucy. "Foxes," said Edmund. "Rabbits," said Susan. But the next morning, there was a steady rain falling, so thick that when you looked out the window, you couldn't see the mountains or the woods or even the stream in the garden. "Oh, of course it would be raining," said Edmund. They had just finished their breakfast with the professor and were upstairs in the room that he had set apart for them, a long, low room with 2 windows looking out in one direction and 2 windows in another. "Oh, do stop grumbling, Ed," said Susan. "10 to 1 it'll clear up in an hour or so, and in the meantime we're pretty well off. There's a radio and lots of books." This is before the days of television. You knew that, didn't you? Yes. "Not for me," said Peter. "I'm going to explore in the house." Everyone agreed to this, and that's how the adventure began. It was the sort of house that you've never seemed to come to the end of, and it was full of unexpected places. The first few doors they tried led only into spare bedrooms, as everybody expected that they would. But soon they came to a very long room full of pictures and suits of armor, and after that there was a room all hung with green with a harp in one corner. And then there came 3 steps down and 5 steps up, and then a sort of little stairs hall and a door that led out onto a balcony, and then a whole series of rooms that led onto each other and were loaded with books, many of them very old books, bigger than Bibles in a church. And shortly after that, they looked into a room that was quite empty, except for one big wardrobe. Do you remember about wardrobes from the last book that we read? You remember that they are a piece of furniture that British houses would have in a bedroom because they don't have closets. So a wardrobe is a big piece of furniture with doors, and inside would be maybe shelves and drawers, and also a wider space with a bar across it where you could hang up your clothes. And it usually was a beautiful piece of furniture. Sometimes the front door had a big mirror in it, so that when the door was closed, you could stand in front of it and get yourself dressed so that you made sure that all the parts that were supposed to be tucked in were tucked in, that kind of thing. Anyway, that's a wardrobe. And the room was quite empty except for one wardrobe, the sort that has a mirror in the door. There was nothing else in the room at all except a dead fly on the windowsill. "Nothing there," said Peter, and they all trooped out again, except Lucy. She stayed behind because she thought it might be worthwhile trying the door of the wardrobe, even though she felt sure that it would probably be locked. To her surprise, it opened up quite easily, and 2 mothballs rolled out. Mothballs were something that people put in their closets During the off seasons when they weren't wearing those clothes, if it was winter and there were coats in there, or summer and there were coats in there, they'd put mothballs in there, which were really, really smelly little white balls of stuff that stopped moths from coming in there. Moths hate the smell of mothballs. So do most people, but moths wouldn't go in there and eat up your nice clothes if you put your mothballs in there. So that's what people generally did. And here's a picture of the room, and you can see the wardrobe over there in the corner. Okay. Looking into the inside, she saw several coats hanging up, mostly long fur coats. There was nothing Lucy liked so well as the smell and feel of fur. She immediately stepped into the wardrobe and got in among the coats, and she rubbed her face against them, leaving the door open, of course, because she knew that it was very foolish to shut the door of a wardrobe and shut yourself in. Soon she went further in and found that there was a second row of coats hanging up behind the first one. It was almost quite dark in there, and she kept her arms stretched out in front of her so as not to bump her face into the back of the wardrobe. She took a step further, then 2 or 3 steps, always expecting to find woodwork against the tips of her fingers, but she could not feel it. "This must be a simply enormous wardrobe," Lucy said, going still further in and pushing the soft folds of the coats aside to make room for her. Then she noticed that there was something crunching under her feet. "I wonder if that's more mothballs," she thought, stooping down to feel it with her hand. But instead of feeling the smooth wood of the floor of the wardrobe, she felt something soft and powdery and extremely cold. "This is very queer," she said, and went on a step or 2 further. Next moment, she found that what was rubbing against her face and hands was no longer soft fur, but something hard and rough and even prickly. "Why, this is just like the branches of a tree," she thought. And then she saw that there was a light ahead of her, not a few inches away where the back of the wardrobe ought to be, but a long way off. And something cold and soft was falling on her. A moment later, she found that she was standing in the middle of a wood at night time, with snow under her feet and snowflakes falling through the air. Lucy felt a little frightened, but she was very inquisitive as well, and excited. She looked back over her shoulder, and there, between the dark tree trunks, she could still see the open doorway of the wardrobe, and even catch a glimpse of the empty room from which she had set out. She had, of course, left the door open, for she knew that it's a very silly thing to shut oneself in a wardrobe. It seemed to be still daylight there. "I can always get back if something goes wrong," thought Lucy, and she began to walk forward, crunch, crunch, over the snow and through the wood toward the other light. In about 10 minutes she reached it and found that it was a lamp post. As she stood looking at it, wondering why there was a lamp post in the middle of a wood and wondering what to do next, she heard a pitter-patter of feet coming toward her. There's the lamp post. Does that look familiar to you? Do you know how that lamppost got there? I bet you do. And soon after that, a very strange person stepped out from among the trees into the light of the lamppost. He was only a little taller than Lucy herself, and he carried over his head an umbrella, white with snow. From the waist upward, he was like a man, but his legs were shaped like goat's legs, and the hair on them was glossy black. And instead of feet, he had goat's hoofs. He also had a tail, but Lucy didn't notice that at first because he had it caught over his arm, and that arm was holding an umbrella. And he had this tail slung over his arm to keep it from trailing in the snow. He had a red woolen scarf around his neck, and his skin was rather reddish too. He had a strange but pleasant little face, with a short pointed beard and curly hair, and out of the hair there stuck 2 horns, one on each side of his forehead. One of his hands, as I've said, carried the umbrella, and in the other he carried several brown paper parcels. What with the parcels and the snow, it just looked like he'd been doing his Christmas shopping. He was a fawn. And when he saw Lucy, he gave such a start of surprise that he dropped all his parcels. "Good gracious me," said the fawn. Just in case you're having a hard time picturing what a fawn might look like, here's the cover of the book, and you can see a picture of our fawn standing there with his parcels under his arm. A fawn is a mythical creature that we read about when we read Greek mythology and whatnot, and it was half man and half goat. And we'll meet other mythical creatures in here too. And in Narnia, C.S. Lewis has made them all come to life. And that is the end of chapter 1. And you know what? It was a short chapter, so I'm going to go straight on to chapter 2. What Lucy found there. "Good evening," said Lucy. But the fawn was so busy picking up his parcels that at first he didn't reply. And when he had finished, he made her a little bow. Good evening, said the fawn. "Excuse me, don't want to be inquisitive, but should I be right in thinking that you are a daughter of Eve?" "My name's Lucy," she said, not quite understanding him. "But you are, forgive me, you are what is called a girl?" "Of course I'm a girl," said Lucy. "You are, in fact, human?" "Of course I'm human," said Lucy, a little bit puzzled. To be sure, said the fawn. "How stupid of me, but I've never seen a son of Adam or a daughter of Eve before. I am delighted. That is to say," and then it stopped as if it had been going to say something it had not intended, but had remembered in time. Delighted. Allow me to introduce myself. My name is Tumnus." "I'm very pleased to meet you, Mr. Tumnus," said Lucy. "And may I ask, O Lucy, daughter of Eve, how did you come to get into Narnia?" "Narnia? What's that?" "This is the land of Narnia," said the fawn, "where we are now. All that lies between the lamppost and the great castle of Cair Paravel on the eastern sea. And you? Did you come from the wild woods of the west?" I got in through the wardrobe in the spare room," said Lucy. "Ah," said Mr. Tumnus in a melancholy voice, "if only I had worked a little harder in geography when I was a little fawn, I should no doubt know about these strange countries, but it's too late now." "But they aren't countries at all," said Lucy, almost laughing. "It's only back there. At least, I'm not sure, but it's summer there." "Meanwhile," said Mr. Tumnus, "it is winter here in Narnia and has been for ever so long. And we shall both catch cold if we stand here talking in the snow. Daughter of Eve, from the faraway land of Spare where eternal summer reigns around the bright city of Wardrobe, how would it be if you came and had tea with me?" "Thank you very much, Mr. Tumnus," said Lucy, "but I think perhaps I'd better be getting back." "It's only just around the corner," said the fawn, "and there'll be a roaring fire and toast and sardines and cake." "Well, it's very kind of you," said Lucy, "but I shan't be able to stay long." "If you will take my arm, daughter of Eve," said Mr. Tumnus, "I shall be able to hold the umbrella over both of us. That's the way. Now, off we go." And so Lucy found herself walking through the wood arm in arm with this strange creature as if they had known each other all their lives. They had not gone very far when they came to a place where the ground became rough, and there were rocks all around, and little hills going up and little hills going down. And at the bottom of one small valley, Mr. Tumnus turned aside suddenly as if he were going to walk straight into an unusually big rock. But at the last moment, Lucy found that he was leading her into the entrance of a cave. As soon as they were inside, she found herself blinking in the light of a wood fire. Mr. Tumnus stooped and took a flaming piece of wood out of the fire with a neat little pair of tongs and lit a lamp. "Now, we shan't be long," he said, and immediately put a kettle on. Lucy thought she had never seen a nicer place. It was a little, dry, clean cave of reddish stone with a carpet on the floor and two little chairs, one for me and one for a friend, said Mr. Tumnus. Here's Mr. Tumnus's little room. And there was a table and a dresser and a mantelpiece over the fire, and above that a picture of an old fawn with a gray beard. On one corner there was a door that Lucy thought must lead to Mr. Tumnus's bedroom, and on one wall was a shelf full of books. Lucy looked at these while he was setting out the tea things. They had titles like The Life and Letters of Silenius, or Nymphs and Their Ways, or Men, Monks, and Gamekeepers, a Study in Popular Legend, or Is Man a Myth? Now, daughter of Eve, said the fawn. And it really was a wonderful tea. Tea is what they call a late afternoon meal, like a light supper that we might have. There was a nice brown egg lightly boiled, one for each of them, and then sardines on toast, and then buttered toast, and then toast with honey, and then a sugar-topped cake. And when Lucy was tired of eating, the fawn began to talk. He had wonderful tales to tell of life in the forest. He talked about the midnight dances and how the nymphs who lived in the wells and the dryads who lived in the trees came out to dance with the fawns. After long parties in the milk-white stag who could give you wishes if you caught him, about feasting and treasure-seeking with the wild red dwarfs in deep mines and caverns far below the forest floor. And then about summer, when the woods were green and old Silenus on his fat donkey would come to visit them, and sometimes Bacchus himself. And then the streams would run with wine instead of water, and the whole forest would have a jolly time for weeks on end. Not that it isn't always winter now, he said gloomily. But then, to cheer himself up, he took out from its case on the dresser a strange little flute that looked like it was made out of straw and began to play. And the tune he played made Lucy want to laugh and cry and dance and go to sleep all at the same time. It must have been hours later when she shook herself and said, "Oh, Mr. Tumnus, I am sorry to stop you, and I do love that tune, really I do, but I must go home. I only planned to stay for a few minutes." "It's no good now, you know," said the fawn, laying down his flute and shaking his head at her sorrowfully. "No good?" said Lucy, jumping up and feeling rather frightened. "What do you mean? I've got to go home at once. The others will be wondering what has happened to me." But a minute later, she said, "Mr. Tumnus, whatever is the matter?" For Mr. Thomas's brown eyes had filled with tears, and the tears were trickling down his cheeks. And soon they were running off the end of his nose, and at last he covered his face with his hands and began to howl. "Mr. Tumnus, Mr. Tumnus," said Lucy, in great distress. Don't, what is the matter? Aren't you well? Dear Mr. Tumnus, do tell me what's wrong." But the fawn continued sobbing as if his heart would break. And even when Lucy went over and put her arms around him and loaned him her handkerchief, he couldn't stop. He merely took the handkerchief and kept on using it, wringing it out with both hands whenever it got too wet. Here he is crying, poor Mr. Tumnus. So that presently Lucy was standing in a damp patch. "Mr. Tumnus!" yelled Lucy in his ear, shaking him. "Do stop at once! You ought to be ashamed of yourself, a great big fawn like you. What on earth are you crying about?" Oh, I'm crying because I'm such a bad fawn." "I don't think you're a bad fawn at all," said Lucy. "I think you're a very good fawn. You're the nicest fawn I've ever met." "Oh, you would say that if you knew," said Mr. Tumnus between his sobs. "No, I'm a bad fawn. I don't suppose there was ever a worse fawn since the beginning of the world." "But what have you done?" said Lucy. "My old father, now," said Mr. Tumnus, "that's his picture on the mantelpiece. He would never have done a thing like this." "A thing like what?" said Lucy. "Like what I've done. Taken service under the White Witch. That's what I am. I'm a spy for the White Witch. The White Witch? Who is she? Do we know who she is? I think we can guess. Why, it is she that has got all Narnia under her thumb. It is she that makes it always winter, and never Christmas. Think of that. How awful, said Lucy. But what does she pay you for? That's the worst part of it, said Mr. Tumnus with a deep groan. I'm a kidnapper for her. That's what I am. Look at me, daughter of Eve. Would you believe that I'm the sort of fawn to meet a poor innocent child in the wood, one that has never done me any harm, and pretend to be friendly with it, and invite it home to my cave for the sake of lulling it to sleep, and then handing it over to the White Witch? No, said Lucy, I'm sure you wouldn't do anything of the sort. But I have, said Mr. Tumnus. Well, said Miss Lucy rather slowly, for she wanted to be truthful and yet not be too hard on him. Well, that was pretty bad, but you're so sorry. I'm so sorry that I turned 2 pages. You're so sorry, but I'm sure you'll never do it again. Daughter of Eve, don't you understand? Said the fawn. It isn't something I have done. I'm doing it now at this very moment. What do you mean? Said Lucy, turning very white. You are the child. I had orders from the White Witch that if ever I saw a son of Adam or a daughter of Eve in the wood, I was to catch them and hand them over to her. And you are the first I ever met. And I've pretended to be your friend, and I asked you to tea, and all the time I've been meaning to wait until you were asleep and then go and tell her. Oh, but you won't, said Mr. Tumnus, said Lucy. You won't, will you? Indeed, you really rather must not. And if I don't, he said, beginning to cry again, she is sure to find out, and she'll have my tail cut off, and my horns sawn off, and my beard plucked out, and she'll wave her wand over me, and my beautiful cloven hooves, and she'll turn them into horrible soft, solid hooves like a wretched horse's, and if she's especially angry at me, she'll turn me to stone. Like the stones on, let me start that again. And if she's extra specially angry at me, she'll turn me into stone, and I shall only be a statue of a fawn in her horrible house until the 4 thrones of Cair Paravel are filled, and goodness knows when that's ever going to happen. I'm very sorry, Mr. Tumnus, said Lucy, but please let me go home. Of course I will, said the fawn. Of course I've got to. I see that now. I hadn't known what humans were like before I met you. Of course I can't give you up to the witch. Not now that I know you, but we must be off at once. I'll see you back to the lamppost, and I suppose you can find your own way back there to Spare and Wardrobe. I'm sure I can, said Lucy. We must go as quietly as we can, said Mr. Tumnus. The whole wood is full of her spies. Even some of the trees are on her side. So they both got up and left the tea things on the table, and Mr. Tumnus once more put his umbrella over her and gave Lucy his arm, and they went out into the snow. The journey back was not at all like the journey to the fawn's cave. They stole along as quickly as they could without speaking a word, and Mr. Tumnus kept to the darkest places. Lucy was relieved when they reached the lamppost again. Do you know your way from here, daughter of Eve? Lucy looked very hard between the trees and could just see in the distance a patch of light that looked like daylight. Yes, she said, I can see the wardrobe door. Then be off as quick as you can, said the fawn, and can you ever forgive me for what I meant to do? Of course I can, said Lucy, shaking him by the hand, and I do hope you won't get into any dreadful trouble on my account. Farewell, daughter of Eve. Perhaps I may keep your handkerchief? Oh, rather, said Lucy, and then ran toward the far-off patch of daylight as fast as her legs would carry her. And presently, instead of rough branches brushing past her, she felt coats, and instead of crunching snow under her feet, she felt wooden boards. And all at once, she found herself jumping out of the wardrobe into the same empty room from which the whole adventure had started. She shut the wardrobe tightly behind her and looked around, panting for breath. It was still raining, And she could hear the voices of the other in the passage. "I'm here," she shouted. "I'm here. I've come back. I'm all right." And that's the end of chapter 2. Well, that was exciting, wasn't it? I know we're going to enjoy this book a lot. All right, boys and girls, ladies and gentlemen, whoever's listening, I'll see you again next time when we read chapter 3. And for now, bye.